is really about the history of the state. It's about the birth and the life of the state. I was really amazed at what this state has contributed to the world.
I think I was surprised by how significant the history of Illinois in the scheme of the nation and the world really is, and how many really just interesting and exceptional people have come from this state. This is an in-house curated exhibition, and it is the largest in-house curated exhibition in the history of both Peoria Riverfront Museum and our predecessor, Lakeview Museum of Arts and Sciences.
The state has so many areas to be proud of. We really wanted to represent that with as many different types of objects as we could. The John Deere plow is really a standout item in this exhibition and a really important part of Illinois history and American history. He was a blacksmith, so he was manufacturing all sorts of farm implements and other tools. And he had a breakthrough one day when he saw a broken sawmill blade from a wood mill. And he sort of realized that that blade, that highly polished surface of that blade, would be able to cut through the Midwestern soil better than the plows that people were currently using. People were using cast iron plows, and the sticky soil would get stuck on the plow, and the farmer would have to stop and scrape off his blade constantly. The polished steel allowed this dirt to fall off of it in a way that it had not done before. And so John Deere really revolutionized agriculture. He made the planting in the Midwestern soil so much more efficient and increased the amount of yield a farmer could get from his plot with his invention. He really changed the world. He started mass producing his plows. By 1849, he had produced 2,000 plows, which was also a revolutionary concept to start making them before people had even ordered them yet. So he invented his plow here in Illinois in Grand Detour, and then later on, after he had become a little bit more successful, moved his business to Moline to make use of the river and the water transportation that was easily accessible there. Deere & Company became the largest plow manufacturer in the world. One of our displays is about the discovery of the mass production of penicillin, which happened here in Peoria. Penicillin, of course, was accidentally discovered in England in 1924. Alexander Fleming discovered a naturally occurring strain of penicillin in Britain and knew that that had the potential to save thousands of lives. However, he didn't know how to reproduce that mold. World War II is happening, and we really needed ways to save soldiers' lives from infections. So in Britain, they started working to grow more of the penicillin mold. But with the natural process, it was really difficult to do. So they knew that here in Peoria at the Ag Lab, there are scientists that were really good at reproducing strains of bacteria and working with corn steep liquor, which is something that we were using to grow molds. So they grew as much of the naturally occurring penicillin mold as they could, and were able to purify it and bring it undercover to the United States. And they came right here to Peoria, to the Peoria's Ag Lab, where they worked with Dr. Andrew Moyer and other teams of scientists to try to purify that mold and figure out how to mass produce it. Dr. Andrew Moyer's team did figure out how to increase the yield about 10 times by growing it on that corn steep liquor, an agricultural byproduct, which is what our ag lab here is all about, using the byproducts of the corn and soy and other crops that are grown in the Midwest. And then Andrew Moyer added milk sugar to it and increased the yield even more. But what was really important was finding a way to get the penicillin mold to grow in big vats, because even with these innovations or discoveries that had taken place, there was still not enough penicillin being produced. So finally, the ag lab here was starting to collect various types of mold from all over the world. It was being flown in from China and other countries all over the world, different types of mold that was found in soils and growing on different foods. And also locally, we had a call out for people to bring in their mold to the ag lab. I was a research scientist here at the ag lab who's nicknamed Moldy Mary, who has actually found a strain of penicillin mold on a piece of cantaloupe that had come from a local market that was much stronger than the strain that had been discovered in Britain. And then that was further mutated by the University of Minnesota so that it was producing 1,000 times more than the original discovery of penicillin. Scientists were able to mass produce penicillin, which saved so many lives. It's estimated that 12 to 15% of soldiers' lives in World War II were saved by penicillin. And then countless lives worldwide have been saved by penicillin since then. And much of that work is due to the scientists at the Ag Lab. The other Ag Lab display that we have here in the museum is a recreation of the workbench of Dr. Aline Jeans. She was a chemist who worked at the Ag Lab for a long time and contributed to science in a lot of ways. The most important is probably she discovered how to synthetically produce dextran, which is a naturally occurring polysaccharide, but it was used in the Vietnam and Korean Wars as a blood plasma extender and saved a lot of lives. She isolated the strain of dextran from some bacteria-contaminated root beer that was supplied by a local company, and then was able to isolate the compound and find out how to synthetically recreate it, which also saved thousands of lives in American conflicts. She is also known for helping produce xanthan gum, which if you have ever looked at the ingredients list on something with oil and water mixed together like salad dressing, if you read down the list, you'll find xanthan gum in most of the ingredients list of that sort of item in your grocery store. It is used in all sorts of food products and again, made from an agricultural byproduct.
So in the 17th century, the French explorers began mining and exporting coal from Illinois. They sent it down the Mississippi all the way to Louisiana. And then you see a real rise in that in the 19th century. Illinois ranks third in overall coal production. So we have a candle holder, also called a sticking Tommy. And what was interesting about that is it has a very sharp point on it where it can be stuck in a crevice on the rock or a wooden beam that helps hold open the top of the cave. But if you can imagine with the coal mining, you're releasing a lot of natural gases. So this open flame was very dangerous, and it is one of the items that really precipitated the formation of labor movements with coal mining to provide safer working conditions. And one of the later inventions that helped provide safer working conditions is the aluminum Davy safety lamp, which was invented by Humphrey Davy. Was invented in the early 19th century and really gained use in the later 19th century and early 20th century as the rise of the coal mining labor movement took. And what was significant about the Davy safety lamp was that there was a piece of glass and a screen that shielded the flame, and it would allow it to not combust. With the Davy safety lamp and the presence of methane gas, the lamp would burn higher with a blue tinge, allowing the coal miner to know if he was in the presence of methane gas, allowing him to quickly exit the area. The Emancipation Proclamation desk and chair are on loan from us from the Chicago History Museum. The story behind the desk and chair is that it was in the White House, and it was a writing desk used by President Abraham Lincoln. The desk was given to Samuel P. Chase, who at the time was the Supreme Court Justice. And from there, we sort of lose the history how it changed hands from Samuel P. Chase and ended up at the Chicago History Museum. President Lincoln held the Emancipation Proclamation for some time, one, awaiting a Union victory, and two, it was very controversial within his cabinet. And so once there was a Union victory, he was able to present the Emancipation Proclamation, and it really set the stage for the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in January of 1865. Once it was passed in the House of Representatives, the state of Illinois actually ended up being the first state to ratify the new 13th Amendment. The cufflink that we have on display is from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library in Springfield, and that cufflink was actually worn by President Lincoln the night he was assassinated, April 14, 1865, at Ford's Theater. The cufflink has an interesting history after that point in time. The second surgeon to arrive to help care for President Lincoln was Dr. Charles Taft. Now, the Lincoln family actually had some family history with Charles Taft prior to this, so I can imagine that Mary was maybe a bit relieved to see Dr. Charles Taft on that night. Well, Taft removed the cufflinks to check for where the wound could possibly be, and he gave the cufflink to Mary Todd, and after Lincoln passed the following day on April 15th, Mary gave one cufflink back to Dr. Charles Taft. His son eventually sold that in 1907, and then from there it made its way to the Presidential Library. But the other cufflink stayed in the Lincoln family. Mary Lincoln Isham actually donated it to the Library of Congress in 1937. And in 2015, there was a display at Ford's Theater, and that was the first time that those cufflinks were ever brought back together since 1865. So the first edition, personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, and he finished his memoirs just days before his death. And again, much like with a lot of the objects in this show, you start to find that they have a little bit more of an interesting history behind them that you don't know when you just know that that object exists. After President Grant left office, his youngest son, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., started an investment business with a gentleman by the name of Frederick Ward. Ward and Grant's investment company turned out to be a little bit of a Ponzi scheme, but the Grant family, they weren't aware of this, including Grant Jr., and Ward was basically embezzling all of the money. Grant Sr. invested all of his money into this firm. The company went bankrupt and the family lost all of their money. They were in financial ruin. And so Grant started selling off his Civil War uniform and some other ephemera, as well as real estate, trying to gain back some of his money. He started writing articles for Century Magazine, and all this time, up to that time and from the end of the Civil War, people approached him about publishing his memoirs and his experiences with the Civil War. Well, about that time, Samuel Clemens approached him and asked him if he would be willing to write the memoirs, and Samuel Clemens' company would then publish them. Grant agreed, and he began writing his memoirs. So he was diagnosed with cancer. He had cancer on his tongue, and it quickly spread to his throat. He was often in a lot of pain. He was really trying to focus on writing his memoirs and getting them finished before he died, so that hopefully he could save his family's finances. He finished the memoirs 3 days before he died, and his wife, Julia, her first royalty check was for $200,000, which was an extreme amount of money at that time. And then by the end of it, her total royalties ended up being about $450,000. And since then, the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant have not been out of print.
So we have in the exhibition a number of writers. Carl Sandburg, of course, from Galesburg, figures prominently in the exhibition. We have a first edition of Cornhuskers written around 1918. Cornhuskers is a book of poems that Sandburg wrote that actually won the Pulitzer Prize. It wasn't really meant to be read. It was actually meant to be heard. So what was interesting about the book particularly is that it was written in a very sprawling, meandering way. So there was a lot of alliteration and cadence and kind of a musical quality to the poetry, almost begging that it be heard rather than read. Sandburg brought literature to the Midwest. At the time, the East Coast was the learned area of our country. That's where our universities were. It's where the highest scholars existed. At the time, we were a farming community, and we weren't really exposed on in a large way to some of these cultural accomplishments. So he felt part of the Midwest. He was part of Illinois, and I think his insistence on keeping it that way is what makes him so special to Illinoisans. It's why he is so indelibly connected to the prairie poets, Illinois in general. Yeah, groundbreaking, because it was literally the first Illinois poet to have a national, international fame. Like Carl Sandburg, Frank Lloyd Wright also brought a very high-end kind of concept of design to the Midwest, to an area that was, very utilitarian-based. Frank Lloyd Wright's home in Peoria on Moss Avenue, the Francis Little House, was built in 1903. One of the earliest of his homes that he was kind of involved in designing and having built. Perfect example of where he was taking architecture into what I'm sure everyone knows, the prairie style, this kind of long, sprawling, very horizontal-oriented type of design. Interestingly, Frank Lloyd Wright didn't just design homes. He designed an entire way of living, really. He designed the windows, he designed the furniture, he designed the silverware. Everything in the home would have been crafted for that impact, that kind of way of living. Often criticized for lack of comfort or various things. His style integrated a kind of warmth of material, wood, glass with color, yet still had a very modern, progressive feel to it. We happen to have one of the pieces of furniture from the little house. Most of that furniture is not even in the state anymore. In fact, a lot of the furniture from the little home could be seen at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's an early version of what we would now consider a recliner. It's very delicate but ingenious kind of levers that lift the back and allow the lower part of the chair to kind of extend outward. It was an attempt by Wright to make his furniture a little more practical. Again, the criticism that he received often was that the furniture was prettier than it was comfortable. So this was kind of an early attempt to rectify the design, that struggle between the perfect design and an actual functionality. Illinois does not claim very many art movements. However, there is one that is synonymous with Chicago and Illinois, and that would be the Chicago Imagists. They were a group of painters primarily from the 60s, 70s, into the 80s that kind of refocused their attention to the figure at a time where high conceptual work was beginning to make its way in, minimalism, abstract work. They kind of retooled and looked back into the figure, brought really interesting, funky coloration into the figure, creating an almost kind of cartoon or a tattoo-like kind of aesthetic, which in its kind of funkiness became connected as an entire group within Illinois. Ed Paschke is probably the most famous, the most recognizable imagist from the group. The thing that makes Ed different than everyone else is he actually integrates a kind of neon coloration into his paintings, which really separates him from everyone else. People thought he used an airbrush, and they almost looked lit from behind. Has that wonderful kind of flowing sensation that a great Michelangelo sculpture has when you see drapery or something. He was captivated by cloth and the way light kind of hits the clothing that you're wearing, and he would stylize and idealize these things greatly. So that kind of neon aesthetic, that kind of bar scene aesthetic was literally kind of built into the painting and fabricated into the making of the work, which made it very unmistakable.
Ronald Reagan is the only president who was born, raised, and educated here in Illinois. He was born in Tampico, Illinois, largely raised in Dixon, and he went to school at Eureka College. Eureka College is the smallest university or college to ever educate and graduate a president of the United States. When he went to Eureka, he really discovered who he could be, that he had the ability and power to inspire people. He gave an address to the student body when he was elected president of his student body, and it was at that time that he said he knew that his words had the power to affect people and inspire people. And I think that really shaped who he would become, because he was known as the great communicator. We have a letter that he wrote back to the college at the occasion of his inaugural address as when he was elected governor of California. It's a really important piece because it shows how deeply he cared about his time here in Illinois and at Eureka. He addressed it to my dear friends, and he talked about how he doesn't really know how he got to this point in his life of being elected governor. It wasn't a plan on his part that got him elected, but he says that without his time at Eureka, he never would have had the confidence or belief in himself to become this position in life. And so I think that speaks highly of Illinois. It speaks to President Reagan's deep appreciation for his time in Illinois and at Eureka. We have on display in this exhibition the pen that President Barack Obama used to write his first executive order. He gave this signed pen to Secretary Ray LaHood. Ray LaHood, of course, represented the Peoria area in the 18th Congressional District for many, many years. President Obama spent a lot of time in Illinois. He was a teacher at the University of Chicago. He, of course, was a member of the Illinois Senate and then went on to represent Illinois in the U.S. Senate and then was elected from Illinois as our first African American president.
What's important to understand with this exhibition is it is not just a heavy history exhibit. We really wanted to explore all areas of Illinois, both past and present, and one of that being a little bit of pop culture, especially with the athletes that have either played the majority of their careers in Illinois or who are from local areas like Ben Zobrist.
There was a 100-year, a very famous losing streak, or not losing streak, but a non-winning World Series streak, of course, in Illinois. And Illinois became kind of synonymous in sports with the lovable losers, the Chicago Cubs. And that day changed so many lives. That hit in, Game 7, the double by Ben Zobrist, Eureka native, was massive. We happened to have the batting glove and the helmet that Ben wore when that hit heard round the world happened, and we're so proud of it. Mr. Cub, Ernie Banks, is represented in the show. We have an entire case full of various memorabilia. We have an award, the Red Smith Nice Guy Award from 1969. Obviously, his accomplishments on the field were massive, but that award was really given as a result of his amazing sportsmanship, his demeanor on the field through the years as well. We also have a 1958 rookie card in that cabinet as well. I can't say enough about the scope of this exhibition, the diversity of approach within individual objects. Objects tell stories. Those stories inspire people.
It allows visitors to take a look at the important and national figures that came from Illinois.